The blood pooled black against the cabin floor. 17-year-old Martha Hensley's fingers still clutching the corn-husk doll she'd been mending when the shooting started. Outside, voices called across the hollow in celebration, not mourning. Andy Boshears wiped his rifle clean on his shirt sleeve, while Henry Willis reloaded, both men grinning as children peeked from behind trees to witness what their grandfathers would later call justice served proper. This was Pike County, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1873, where kinship determined right from wrong, and where two men who'd once tried to kill each other had become the mountain's most feared partnership. The Hensley cabin smoldered behind them, 6 bodies cooling inside. But the real horror wasn't the killing itself. It was how the community gathered afterward to shake hands with the shooters, to clap them on shoulders, to invite them home for supper. In Appalachian feuding culture, Andy Boshears and Henry Willis weren't murderers. They were heroes defending family honor against an ancient wrong, and the mountains would sing their names for generations. The Cumberland Mountains rose like broken teeth against the October sky, their ridges scarred by generations of timber cutting and strip mining that left the hollows shadowed even at midday. Wood smoke drifted from cabin chimneys, mixing with the metallic scent of early frost and the constant sound of Tug Fork Creek rushing over stones worn smooth by 100 years of runoff. This was eastern Kentucky in 1873, where families had been killing each other since before the Revolutionary War, and where the law came from Winchester rifles, not courthouse gavels. Pike County stretched across some of the roughest country in the Cumberland Range, a landscape that bred hard people who settled disputes with blood and measured worth by how many kinfolk would stand beside you when trouble came calling. The mountains themselves seemed designed for feuding. Narrow hollows provided perfect ambush sites. Ridge lines offered clear shooting lanes. Dense forests gave cover for escape routes that only locals knew. Every family compound sat like a fortress, with clear fields of fire and multiple paths to disappear into the timber. Andy Boshears owned 300 acres of rocky bottomland along Left Beaver Creek, property his grandfather had claimed by killing 2 Cherokee hunters in 1796. The Boshears clan had multiplied across 4 generations into a network of cousins, in-laws, and blood relations that stretched through 6 adjoining counties. They were tall people with dark hair and pale eyes, known for quick tempers and long memories. Andy himself stood 6 feet 2 inches in his bare feet, with hands like axe handles and a voice that carried across a holler when he chose to raise it. Henry Willis farmed the next valley over on Blackberry Creek, where his family had settled after the War of 1812. The Willis bloodline ran shorter and stockier than the Boshears, but they were equally numerous and twice as mean when crossed. Henry had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to a sawmill accident in 1868, but he could still shoot a rifle well enough to put 5 bullets through a playing card at 50 yards. His remaining fingers were as steady as stone. The 2 men had been trying to kill each other for 7 years. The feud between Andy Boshears and Henry Willis began with a boundary dispute in 1866, when both men claimed ownership of a 40-acre timber tract that lay between their properties. The land contained some of the finest white oak in Pike County, trees worth $300 each to the railroad companies building through the region. Neither man had clear title. Both had family stories dating the claim to their grandfather's time. Both were willing to die before backing down. The first blood was drawn on a rainy Tuesday in April of 1867. Andy Boshears found Henry Willis cutting timber on the disputed tract and ordered him off at gunpoint. Willis refused to leave. Boshears fired a warning shot that clipped bark from a tree 6 inches from Willis's head. Willis returned fire with a shotgun blast that peppered Boshears with birdshot from shoulder to hip. Both men survived, but the wound patterns told anyone who examined them that this had been a killing attempt, not a warning. Over the following months, the violence escalated through a careful choreography that both men understood instinctively. Livestock disappeared from each other's pastures. Barns caught fire under suspicious circumstances. Fences were cut and rebuilt again. Each act of sabotage demanded a response slightly more severe than what had been done before. The mountains watched and waited to see which man would cross the line that couldn't be uncrossed. That line came in November of 1868, when Henry Willis's youngest brother, Thomas, was found dead beside a deer trail on Blackberry Creek. The 18-year-old had been shot through the back of the head with a large caliber rifle from a distance of 30 yards or more. No one saw the killing happen, but everyone knew Andy Boshears owned the only rifle in the valley capable of making that shot from that range. Thomas Willis had never been involved in the boundary dispute. His death transformed a property fight between two men into a blood feud between two families. The Willis clan demanded justice. They rode to the county seat in Pikeville and swore out a murder warrant against Andy Boshears. But the sheriff, Edgar Hatfield, was cousin to Andy's wife and declined to serve the paper. The Willis family appealed to the state authorities in Frankfort, but Pike County was 3 days hard riding from the capital, and eastern Kentucky disputes had a way of resolving themselves without government interference. By the time any outside law could reach out on the mountains, the Willis clan had taken justice into their own hands. They came for Andy Boshears on a moonless night in December, 23 men carrying rifles and rope. But the Boshears family had been expecting this visit. The cabin was empty except for 3 sticks of dynamite wired to the front door. The explosion killed 2 Willis men instantly and wounded 5 others badly enough that they never walked properly again. Andy Boshears had vanished into the timber with his wife and 3 children, disappearing so completely that some people wondered if the dynamite had claimed him too. Andy Boshears spent the winter of 1868 hiding in a cave system along Grapevine Creek, 20 miles south of his burned homestead. His wife Martha brought supplies when she could slip away unnoticed, but most days he survived on what he could trap or steal from isolated cabins. The cold was bitter enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, and the constant dampness gave him a cough that would plague him for the rest of his life. But the isolation also gave him time to think about the mathematics of his situation. 23 Willis men had come to hang him. He'd killed 2 and crippled 5 more, leaving 16 healthy enemies who wanted him dead. His own clan numbered 14 fighting-age men, but half of them lived in adjoining counties and might not risk their lives for a boundary dispute that had gotten out of hand. Simple arithmetic suggested that Andy Boshears was going to die unless he could change the equation somehow. The solution came to him on a February morning when he spotted Henry Willis hunting alone in the timber above Grapevine Creek. Willis was following a deer trail that led directly past the cave mouth where Boshears had been hiding for 2 months. It would be the easiest shot Andy had ever made. 50 yards, clear line of sight, target moving slowly and predictably. One bullet would end the feud and probably save Andy's life, since the Willis clan would likely lose their appetite for revenge once their leader was dead. Andy Boshears raised his rifle and drew a careful bead on Henry Willis's back. His finger took up slack on the trigger, and then he lowered the weapon without firing. What happened next became legend in Pike County, though the details varied depending on who told the story. Some said Andy called out Henry's name and challenged him to a fair fight. Others claimed Henry spotted the rifle barrel and demanded to know why Andy hadn't taken the shot. A few insisted both men simply recognized that killing each other would solve nothing as long as their families remained enemies. What everyone agreed on was the conversation that followed. "You got a clean shot," Henry Willis said, keeping his hands well away from his own rifle. "Why ain't you taking it?" "Because shooting you won't end this," Andy replied. "Your kin will just find somebody else to follow, and my kin will keep dying until there ain't none of us left." They talked for 2 hours in the February cold, crouched among the leafless trees like animals acknowledging a temporary truce. They were both intelligent men despite their circumstances, and they could see how the feud was consuming their families like a cancer. Children were afraid to play outside. Women couldn't tend gardens without armed guards. Old people were dying of worry and stress. The mountains themselves seemed poisoned by the constant threat of violence. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Andy Boshears and Henry Willis had reached an understanding that would reshape Pike County forever. They would end their personal conflict, but they wouldn't simply declare peace and return to their separate valleys. Instead, they would form an alliance that combined the military strength of both clans into something far more dangerous than either family had been alone. They would become partners in the business of mountain justice, offering their services to anyone who needed enemies eliminated and could pay the price they demanded. The blood pact was sealed with a handshake that February afternoon, but the real proof came 6 months later when both families gathered at the burned remains of the disputed timber tract. Andy Boshears and Henry Willis stood before their assembled kinfolk and announced that the boundary line no longer mattered. They would work the land together and split the profits equally. Anyone who objected to this arrangement could settle the matter with guns, but they would be fighting both clans simultaneously instead of just one. Nobody objected. The partnership between Andy Boshears and Henry Willis transformed from necessity into opportunity with the efficiency of men who understood that violence, properly organized, could be more profitable than farming. By the spring of 1870, they had established what they called a debt collection service for families throughout eastern Kentucky who lacked the manpower to settle their own grievances. The fees were reasonable: $50 for intimidation, $100 for permanent solutions, payment in advance or in livestock of equivalent value. Their first paying customers were the Stevens family of Breathitt County, who needed help with a land dispute that had been festering for 3 years. Jacob Stevens owned a valuable creek bottom that his neighbor, William McCoy, claimed by right of prior settlement. The local courts had sided with McCoy based on testimony from witnesses who might or might not have been telling the truth about survey markers and boundary stones. Legal appeals would take years and cost more money than the land was worth, but the Stevens family couldn't afford to lose their most productive acreage. Andy and Henry rode to Breathitt County in late May, when the mountain laurel was blooming and the creeks ran high with snowmelt from the high ridges. They met with Jacob Stevens in his cabin on a Tuesday evening, discussing the situation over corn liquor and discussing terms that both parties understood but never stated directly. No one used words like murder or killing. They talked about solving problems and removing obstacles and clearing the way for proper settlements. The solution was implemented on the following Saturday. William McCoy was found beside his pasture gate with a bullet hole behind his left ear, killed so cleanly that he never had time to draw the pistol he carried for protection. His death appeared to be the result of a robbery gone wrong. His wallet was missing, along with a gold watch that his neighbors knew he always carried. The valuable items were never recovered, which suggested that drifters or desperate men from outside the county had committed the crime. Jacob Stevens expressed appropriate shock and sympathy at his neighbor's tragic death. He attended the funeral and contributed $5 toward a headstone. 6 weeks later, when the period of mourning had passed and McCoy's widow had moved back to live with her family in Virginia, Stevens filed a new claim on the disputed property. This time, there were no contrary witnesses to challenge his ownership. The land was his, legally and permanently, for the price of $100 and enough corn liquor to seal a gentleman's agreement. Word of this successful resolution spread through the mountains with the speed of smoke signals. Families with long-standing disputes began sending messages to Pike County, inquiring about the availability of consultation services. The Boshears-Willis partnership developed a reputation for discretion, efficiency, and fair pricing. They never cheated clients. They never failed to deliver promised results. They never left evidence that could be traced back to their employers. Within 2 years, they were booking engagements 3 months in advance. Their success created an economic boom in both valleys. Andy Boshears built a new cabin twice the size of his original home, with glass windows and a stone foundation that would last generations. Henry Willis purchased a steam-powered sawmill that could process timber faster than any operation in Pike County. Both families invested their profits in additional land, livestock, and farm equipment that made them more prosperous than they had ever imagined possible. Their children attended school in Pikeville instead of learning letters at home. Their wives wore store-bought dresses instead of homespun fabric. But prosperity came with obligations that neither man had anticipated when they first shook hands beside Grapevine Creek. The autumn of 1873 brought an unusually difficult case that would test the limits of the Boshears-Willis partnership and establish their reputation for handling situations that other men wouldn't touch. The client was Rebecca Flanagan, a widow from Floyd County, whose family had been locked in a 3-generation feud with the Hensley clan over a matter involving stolen horses, violated agreements, and murdered kinfolk that dated back to the 1840s. Rebecca's husband, Patrick, had been killed 2 years earlier in what authorities ruled an hunting accident, though everyone in Floyd County knew that James Hensley had been stalking Patrick through the woods for 3 days before the accidental shooting occurred. Patrick's death left Rebecca with 4 young children and a farm that she couldn't work alone, but she couldn't sell the property and move away because the Hensley family would claim the land by right of conquest the moment she abandoned it. The widow needed the entire Hensley bloodline eliminated, not just James Hensley, who had pulled the trigger. The family included James's father, Samuel, his 3 brothers, 2 adult sons, and various cousins who lived within 5 miles of the Flanagan property. Removing them one by one would take months and give the survivors time to organize defensive measures or call in outside help. Rebecca Flanagan wanted them all dead within a single week before they could understand what was happening or mount any effective response. Andy Boshears and Henry Willis had never attempted anything on this scale before. Their previous work had involved isolated individuals whose deaths could be attributed to robbery, accident, or random violence. Killing an entire family would require careful planning, precise timing, and a level of brutality that might draw unwanted attention from state authorities. The fee would need to reflect these additional risks and complications. They met with Rebecca Flanagan on a cold October evening in a cabin halfway between Floyd and Pike counties, neutral ground, where their conversation couldn't be overheard by anyone with connections to either family. Rebecca was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that shook when she wasn't holding something steady. But her voice never wavered as she described exactly what she wanted done to the people who had destroyed her life. "I want them to know they're dying because of what they did to Patrick," she said. staring directly into Andy's eyes without blinking. "I want them to understand that this is payment for blood spilled, not some random misfortune that befell them." The price was $400, more money than most Pike County families saw in 5 years of farming. Rebecca Flanagan paid in gold coins that she pulled from a leather pouch sewn into the lining of her coat. $20 pieces that caught the lamplight like tiny suns. Where a widow woman had acquired such wealth was a question that Andy and Henry were wise enough not to ask, though they both suspected that Patrick Flanagan had been involved in business ventures that extended well beyond legitimate farming. The contract was sealed with a handshake and a shared drink of corn liquor that burned like liquid fire. Rebecca would return to Floyd County and establish an alibi that would place her far from the Hensley property when the killing began. Andy and Henry would handle the logistics of eliminating 6 men and 2 teenage boys within a 7-day window, making each death look like the natural consequence of an escalating feud rather than a coordinated extermination campaign. Nobody dies clean. Planning the Hensley elimination required 3 weeks of careful surveillance and intelligence gathering that transformed Andy Boshears and Henry Willis from casual killers into military strategists. They needed to map every cabin, identify every weapon, catalog every habit and routine that might affect timing or outcomes. Most importantly, they needed to understand the family's defensive capabilities and determine whether the Hensleys suspected that their deaths had been purchased and paid for in advance. Samuel Hensley, the family patriarch, was 68 years old and partially blind from a sawmill accident, but he still carried a double-barreled shotgun everywhere he went and had reflexes quick enough to be dangerous in close quarters. His eldest son, James, was the best rifle shot in Floyd County and owned a Spencer repeating rifle that could fire 7 rounds without reloading. The other 3 brothers were competent with firearms, but tended to drink heavily in the evenings, which created windows of vulnerability that could be exploited by patient killers. The Hensley compound sat in a valley that could only be approached from 3 directions, with steep ridges blocking access from the north and west. The main cabin housed Samuel and his unmarried son Robert. James lived with his wife and 2 children in a smaller cabin 50 yards downhill, near the creek that provided water for the family's livestock. The other brothers had built homes within shouting distance of each other, creating a defensive cluster that would be nearly impossible to assault directly, without sustaining casualties that Andy and Henry couldn't afford. But the geographical advantages that protected the Hensley family also created tactical opportunities for attackers who understood how to turn defensive positions into traps. The narrow valley that made surprise assault difficult also prevented rapid escape if the residents needed to flee under pressure. The creek that provided essential water also created noise that would mask the sound of approaching footsteps. The scattered cabin locations that allowed mutual support also meant that each building would need to be cleared separately, giving attackers multiple opportunities to catch defenders off guard. Andy and Henry spent 2 weeks observing the Hensley daily routines from hidden positions on the surrounding ridges. Samuel rose before dawn to feed livestock and check fence lines. James spent most mornings hunting in the timber above the cabin cluster, usually returning around midday with game for the family's evening meal. The other brothers worked a small tobacco patch that required constant attention during harvest season. Women and children rarely ventured far from the main cabin, except for weekly trips to the general store in Hindman. Most significantly, the entire family gathered for Sunday dinner in Samuel's cabin, a weekly tradition that brought all 6 men and both teenage boys into the same building at the same time. These gatherings lasted from noon until late afternoon, with enough drinking and storytelling to make the participants careless about security measures that they normally observed religiously. Sunday dinner would provide the opportunity that Andy and Henry needed to eliminate the Hensley bloodline in a single coordinated attack. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Andy would position himself on the ridge overlooking the main cabin, with a clear line of sight through the front window where the family gathered around Samuel's dining table. Henry would approach from the creek side, close enough to prevent anyone from escaping through the back door, but far enough away to avoid crossfire if the situation deteriorated into a running gunfight. They would begin shooting simultaneously when the family was seated and relaxed, continuing until no one inside the cabin was capable of returning fire. Sunday, November 2nd, 1873, dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the ground like powdered glass and wood smoke rising straight up in the still air. Perfect killing weather, Andy thought as he cleaned his rifle and counted ammunition. 12 rounds should be sufficient for 6 men and 2 boys, allowing for misses and the possibility that some targets might survive initial wounds long enough to require finishing shots. What would you do if you lived in a community where such planning was considered normal business practice, where neighbors discussed murder contracts with the same casual attention they gave to crop prices or weather patterns? The Hensley family compound looked peaceful in the November sunlight, with chimney smoke drifting lazily across the valley and livestock grazing in pastures that showed the brown stubble of winter grass. Samuel Hensley sat on his front porch cleaning a harness, his shotgun leaning against the cabin wall within easy reach. His grandsons played in the yard, throwing corn cobs at a target they'd painted on the side of the barn. The scene could have been copied from 100 other mountain homesteads, except for the positioning of armed men on the surrounding ridges who were counting the seconds until the killing started. Andy Boshears lay prone behind a fallen oak tree 300 yards above the main cabin. His rifle rested across a rotted trunk that provided both concealment and a steady shooting platform. Through the telescopic sight that had cost him $50 in Louisville, he could see directly through the cabin's front window into the main room where the Hensley family would soon gather for their weekly meal. The angle was perfect. The distance was well within his capability. The only variable was timing, and that would be determined by Henry Willis's position near the creek. Henry had crawled through thick underbrush for 2 hours to reach a cluster of boulders that sat 40 yards from the cabin's rear entrance. From there, he could cover the back door and one side window while remaining invisible to anyone inside the building. His role was to prevent escape and eliminate anyone who survived Andy's initial volley, but he also carried the responsibility for confirming that all targets were present before the shooting began. A complex whistle signal would tell Andy when the family was assembled and positioned for maximum effectiveness. The dinner preparation began at 11:30, when Samuel's daughter-in-law Mary started carrying dishes from the kitchen building to the main cabin. James Hensley returned from his morning hunt with a string of squirrels that would supplement the roasted pork that had been cooking since dawn. The other brothers arrived with their families, each group bringing covered dishes and jugs of corn liquor that would accompany the meal. By noon, 16 people had gathered inside the main cabin, more than Andy and Henry had anticipated when they planned the attack. The additional targets complicated the tactical situation, but didn't change the fundamental objective. Andy adjusted his position slightly to improve his view through the front window, where he could see the extended family taking seats around a table that had been expanded with wooden planks to accommodate the larger gathering. Samuel sat at the head of the table, with James to his right, and the other sons arranged according to age and family hierarchy. The women served food, while the men discussed tobacco prices and local politics, unaware that 2 rifles were trained on their gathering. Henry's whistle signal came at 12:15, a sound so much like a cardinal's call that even Andy had to listen carefully to recognize the artificial pattern. The family was seated and settled, with weapons either left outside the cabin or placed far enough from the table that they couldn't be reached quickly. The targets were clustered in a space roughly 12 feet by 8 feet, close enough together that accurate shooting could eliminate multiple men with each shot. The conditions would never be better than they were at that moment. Andy Boshears took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger of his rifle. The first bullet shattered the front window and took Samuel Hensley through the chest, killing him instantly and spraying blood across the wall behind his chair. The second shot caught James as he tried to rise from the table, the bullet entering just below his left shoulder blade and exiting through his heart. The third shot was aimed at the cluster of younger men who were scrambling for cover, but it struck the wooden table instead, sending splinters flying like shrapnel and drawing screams from the women and children who had no understanding of what was happening to them. From his position near the creek, Henry Willis heard the distinctive crack of Andy's rifle and immediately began his own shooting sequence. His first target was Robert Hensley, who had managed to reach the back door and was trying to escape into the yard. The shotgun blast caught Robert in the doorway, dropping him so hard that his body blocked the exit for anyone else who might try to flee in the same direction. Henry's second shot went through the side window, aimed at movement rather than specific targets, designed to create additional chaos while Andy reloaded his rifle. The killing continued for 6 minutes, a period that seemed both endless and instantaneous to the people trapped inside the cabin. Rifle fire alternated with shotgun blasts in a rhythm that eliminated any possibility of organized resistance or coordinated escape. When the shooting finally stopped, 8 people lay dead inside the main cabin, including all 6 Hensley men and both teenage boys who had tried to shield their mothers with their own bodies. The surviving women and children huddled in the corner farthest from the windows, covered in blood that wasn't their own, and shaking so violently they could barely comprehend the silence that followed the gunfire. Mary Hensley, Samuel's daughter-in-law, was the first to find her voice. "Who's out there?" she called, her words barely audible through the broken window. "What do you want from us?" Andy Boshears stood up behind his fallen oak tree, making himself visible to anyone looking in his direction. "This is payment for Patrick Flanagan," he shouted back, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "Blood for blood, like it should be." Justice served cold. Mary Hensley would carry the image of that Sunday dinner for the remaining 43 years of her life, but she would never speak of it publicly until 1892, when a newspaper reporter from Lexington convinced her to share her testimony for an article about mountain feuding. By then, Andy Boshears and Henry Willis were both dead, and the old woman had nothing left to fear from their families or their allies. Her account, published in the Lexington Herald on September 15, 1892, provided the only detailed record of what happened inside the cabin during those 6 minutes of concentrated killing. "They shot my husband through the back while he was saying grace over the Sunday meal," Mary told the reporter, her voice steady despite the tears that ran down her weathered cheeks. "Then they shot his father, then his brothers, then the boys who tried to help. They didn't stop shooting until every man in that room was dead or dying, and they didn't care that women and children were watching it all happen." The Herald article described Mary's account as a window into the barbaric feuding culture that has plagued eastern Kentucky for generations. But the newspaper's editorial response missed the deeper horror of what Mary Hensley had witnessed. The methodical execution of her family wasn't an explosion of uncontrolled rage or passion. It was a business transaction carried out by professional killers who approached murder with the same attention to detail that other men brought to farming or carpentry. Andy and Henry had spent 3 weeks planning the assault. They had studied the cabin layout, timed the family's routines, and calculated ammunition requirements with mathematical precision. The shooting itself demonstrated tactical coordination that could only have resulted from extensive practice and rehearsal. These were not desperate men acting in the heat of emotion. They were skilled professionals fulfilling a contract that had been negotiated in advance and paid for in gold. Most disturbing of all was the community response to the Hensley massacre. The deaths were reported to Floyd County Sheriff William Collins, who rode to the scene with 2 deputies and a coroner to document the evidence and file official reports. Sheriff Collins interviewed the surviving family members, examined the bullet trajectories, and concluded that the killings had been carried out by parties unknown who had probably fled the region immediately after the attack. No investigation was launched. No suspects were questioned. No arrests were made. The official indifference wasn't the result of incompetence or corruption. Sheriff Collins knew exactly who had killed the Hensley family, just as everyone else in Floyd County understood what had happened and why. But pursuing the case would have required challenging the Boshears-Willis partnership directly, and that was a confrontation that no elected official was prepared to risk. Andy and Henry had become too powerful and too well connected to face legal consequences for their actions. The Hensley property was abandoned after the massacre, with the surviving women and children relocating to Ohio, where they had relatives who could provide protection and support. The empty cabins stood for several years before being torn down for lumber, but the cleared fields reverted to forest with surprising speed. Within a decade, the only evidence of the family's existence was a small cemetery where 8 headstones marked the graves of the men and boys who died during Sunday dinner. Rebecca Flanagan attended the Hensley funerals, dressed in black and carrying flowers that she placed on each grave with appropriate solemnity. She expressed sympathy to the widows and promised to pray for the souls of the departed, a performance that convinced some observers of her genuine grief for the tragic loss of life. Others noted that she waited exactly 1 month after the burials before filing legal papers claiming ownership of the Hensley property by right of debt collection, though no records existed of any loans or financial obligations between the families. The Flanagan claim was approved by the Floyd County Court without opposition, since there were no surviving Hensley men to challenge the ownership transfer. Rebecca moved to the property in the spring of 1874 and lived there until her death in 1889, farming the land that her husband's killers had once worked and raising her children in the valley where 8 people had died to secure her family's future. She never married again, though she received several proposals from men who admired her strength and independence. When asked about her decision to remain a widow, Rebecca would say only that she had already paid too high a price for the land she owned, and had no intention of sharing it with anyone who hadn't suffered equally for the privilege. By the winter of 1874, Andy Boshears and Henry Willis had eliminated 17 men across 6 counties, establishing a reputation that transformed them from local killers into regional legends. Their success rate was perfect. Their methods were innovative. Their discretion was absolute. Families throughout eastern Kentucky whispered their names when discussing problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels or conventional violence. And the whispers always carried the same mixture of fear and admiration that mountain people reserved for natural forces like floods or avalanches. Their business model had evolved beyond simple contract killing into something more sophisticated and sustainable. They now offered 3 distinct service levels: intimidation visits that usually convinced targets to modify their behavior without requiring permanent solutions, carefully staged accidents that eliminated problems while maintaining plausible deniability, and public executions like the Hensley Massacre that sent unmistakable messages to anyone considering similar resistance. Prices ranged from $25 for basic persuasion to $500 for complex elimination campaigns that required extensive planning and coordination. The partnership's success created economic ripple effects throughout Pike County that demonstrated how profitable violence could become when properly organized and marketed. Both families had invested their earnings in legitimate businesses that provided additional income streams and enhanced their social standing within the community. Andy owned interests in 3 sawmills, a general store, and a distillery that produced some of the finest corn liquor in the Cumberland Mountains. Henry had purchased controlling shares in 2 coal mines and a freight company that transported timber and minerals to railroad terminals in Virginia and West Virginia. Their wealth enabled political influence that protected them from legal interference and provided advance warning of any law enforcement activities that might threaten their operations. The Pike County Sheriff, the Commonwealth's attorney, and 2 circuit court judges all owed significant financial obligations to Boshears Willis business enterprises. These relationships ensured that any investigations into suspicious deaths would be conducted with appropriate discretion and that witness testimony would be evaluated with proper skepticism regarding the reliability of mountain folk under emotional stress. But success also created vulnerabilities that neither Andy nor Henry had anticipated when they first formed their partnership. Their reputation for effectiveness had made them indispensable to certain clients, but it had also made them targets for competitors who wanted to claim their territory or eliminate their influence. Other feuding families had begun forming alliances similar to the Boshears-Willis partnership, creating a network of professional killers who competed for the same limited pool of customers and contracts. More dangerous still was the attention their activities had attracted from outside the region. Newspaper reporters from Louisville and Lexington had begun investigating what they called the feuding epidemic in eastern Kentucky, publishing articles that described mountain violence in terms that embarrassed state officials and created pressure for federal intervention. The stories portrayed Andy and Henry as symptoms of a larger cultural problem that threatened to undermine Kentucky's reputation and economic development. Governor Preston Leslie had received formal complaints from business leaders who worried that feuding violence would discourage railroad investment and industrial development in the mountain regions. Northern capitalists were reluctant to commit resources to areas where property rights were enforced through private armies rather than legal institutions. The state's economic future depended on convincing outside investors that Kentucky was a civilized place where business could be conducted safely and profitably. These concerns prompted Governor Leslie to authorize a special investigation into feuding violence, with particular emphasis on identifying and prosecuting the leaders who organized and directed the most serious criminal activities. The investigation would be conducted by agents of the Commonwealth's Detective Bureau, experienced law enforcement officers who couldn't be intimidated or corrupted by local political pressure. Their mission was to gather evidence sufficient to bring federal charges against the feuding leaders and break up the networks that had made contract killing a profitable industry. The investigators arrived in Pike County during the first week of January, 1875. Posing as timber buyers interested in purchasing large tracts of mountain forest for commercial logging operations. Their cover story was convincing enough to gain access to local business leaders and political figures, but experienced killers like Andy Boshears and Henry Willis recognized threats long before they materialized into actual danger. Blood would call to blood. Commonwealth Detective John Morrison arrived in Pikeville on January 8, 1875, carrying credentials that identified him as a representative of the Cumberland Timber Company, seeking to purchase virgin forest tracts throughout eastern Kentucky. His partner, Detective Samuel Ward, presented himself as a surveyor capable of assessing timber quality and calculating harvest yields for potential investment properties. Both men spoke with convincing knowledge of logging operations and carried surveying equipment that appeared authentic to casual observation. But their real expertise involved gathering evidence against criminals who had operated beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Morrison was a compact man with pale blue eyes and prematurely gray hair that made him look older than his 34 years. He had served with the Union Army during the war, rising to the rank of captain in an Ohio infantry regiment that had seen action at Antietam and Gettysburg. His military experience had taught him to recognize tactical situations and assess threats with the speed that kept soldiers alive in hostile territory. Ward was younger and taller, with the kind of forgettable face that allowed him to blend into crowds and observe conversations without attracting attention or suspicion. Their investigation methodology was straightforward but effective. They would establish relationships with local business leaders and political figures, gathering information about feuding activities through casual conversation and careful observation. They would document evidence of criminal conspiracy and interstate commerce violations that could support federal prosecution. Most importantly, they would identify the specific individuals responsible for organizing and directing the violence that had made eastern Kentucky notorious throughout the region. The detectives rented rooms at the Pikeville Hotel and spent their first week meeting with county officials, business owners, and prominent citizens who might provide insight into local political dynamics and economic opportunities. They attended church services, visited saloons, and participated in social gatherings where men would speak freely about local affairs and regional problems that affected business prospects and investment opportunities. Their cover story provided natural opportunities to ask questions about land ownership, property disputes, and the violence that sometimes accompanied boundary disagreements in the mountains. Morrison presented himself as a cautious investor who needed to understand all potential risks before committing company resources to timber purchases in the region. Ward expressed concern about the safety of logging crews who might work in isolated areas where feuding families had been known to settle disputes through armed conflict. The responses they received painted a consistent picture of a community where certain families had acquired disproportionate influence through their willingness to use violence as a business tool. Local officials spoke carefully about unfortunate incidents and regrettable misunderstandings that had resulted in deaths, but they consistently avoided naming specific individuals or providing details that might compromise ongoing relationships with powerful constituents. Business leaders acknowledged that feuding violence created challenges for economic development, but they insisted that the problems were exaggerated by outside newspapers seeking sensational stories. Pike County Sheriff Edgar Hatfield was particularly helpful in explaining the complexities of law enforcement in mountain terrain where traditional policing methods were often ineffective. "You got to understand," he told Morrison during a long conversation in the sheriff's office, "these families been settling their differences the same way for 3 generations. They don't trust courts, don't trust lawyers, don't trust anybody who ain't bloodkin or close enough to be kin. When somebody wrongs them, they handle it themselves, and they handle it permanent." The sheriff's explanation was accurate as far as it went, but it omitted crucial details about the systematic nature of the violence and the commercial relationships that had transformed traditional feuding into a profitable industry. Morrison and Ward recognized the pattern from similar investigations in other regions where organized crime had taken root among communities that distrusted outside authority and preferred to handle problems through informal networks of mutual obligation and shared violence. Their breakthrough came during their second week in Pikeville, when they attended a church social where conversation turned to recent deaths in neighboring counties. An elderly woman named Martha Collins mentioned that her nephew in Floyd County had been asking questions about hiring men to handle a boundary dispute that the courts had been unable to resolve satisfactorily. She spoke with the casual tone of someone discussing routine business arrangements, but her words provided the first direct evidence that contract killing services were being openly marketed within the community. Morrison pursued the conversation carefully, expressing interest as a businessman who might face similar problems if he purchased large tracts of mountain property. "What kind of men would handle something like that?" he asked. "And how would a person contact them if they needed that kind of help?" Martha Collins lowered her voice and glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "There's two families work together," she said. "Been doing it for years now. They don't advertise, but word gets around when somebody needs their services. They charge fair prices and they get results, if you know what I mean." The names came later, whispered across a dinner table where the detectives had been invited as honored guests, representing potential investment in the local economy. Andy Boshears and Henry Willis, the two men who had transformed their personal feud into a business partnership that controlled the market for contract violence throughout eastern Kentucky. Their reputation was legendary among mountain families, who understood that some problems required permanent solutions that couldn't be achieved through legal channels or conventional negotiation. Morrison and Ward spent the following 3 weeks documenting the scope and structure of the Boshears-Willis operation. They identified clients, witnesses, and business relationships that would support federal prosecution under interstate commerce laws. They gathered evidence of conspiracy, racketeering, and murder for hire that could result in death sentences if properly presented to a jury. Most importantly, they developed intelligence about the partnership's current activities and future plans that would enable law enforcement to anticipate and prevent additional killings. But intelligence gathering was dangerous work in a community where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and where asking too many questions could draw unwanted attention from men who killed for a living. Detective Morrison's first mistake was asking too many specific questions about property ownership patterns in areas where suspicious deaths had occurred. His second mistake was taking detailed notes during conversations that he thought were private but were actually being observed by people who understood the difference between legitimate business inquiries and law enforcement investigation. His third and most dangerous mistake was underestimating how quickly information traveled through mountain communities, where everyone was related by blood, marriage, or mutual dependence. Andy Boshears learned about the detectives on February 3, 1875, when his cousin Jacob visited the Pikeville General Store and overheard Morrison asking the proprietor about families who had moved away or died under unusual circumstances during the previous 5 years. Jacob was intelligent enough to recognize an investigation when he heard one, and loyal enough to ride directly to Andy's cabin with a warning that strangers were asking dangerous questions about dangerous people. Henry Willis received similar intelligence from his brother-in-law, who had been present during a conversation where Detective Ward expressed curiosity about the relationship between feuding violence and economic opportunities in the timber industry. The questions were subtle and professionally phrased, but they demonstrated knowledge of specific incidents that could only have come from detailed research into local criminal activities. Timber buyers didn't normally concern themselves with the precise details of family disputes or the methods used to resolve property conflicts. The two partners met that evening in Andy's cabin to discuss the threat and plan their response. They had always known that their success would eventually attract attention from state or federal authorities, but they had assumed that any investigation would be conducted by local officials who could be influenced through existing political relationships. The presence of outside detectives suggested that higher levels of government had decided to treat feuding violence as a serious problem requiring professional law enforcement intervention. "They're building a case," Henry said, cleaning his rifle while he talked. "Gathering names, connecting deaths to our business, probably looking for witnesses who might testify against us in federal court." Andy nodded, understanding the implications. Federal prosecution would mean trials in Louisville or Frankfurt, where their political connections had no influence, and where juries would be composed of urban residents who had no sympathy for mountain customs or feuding traditions. Conviction would mean death sentences or life imprisonment in federal penitentiaries, where they would have no protection from enemies seeking revenge for past killings. "How much time do we have?" Andy asked. "Depends on how much evidence they need and how careful they want to be about building their case," Henry replied. "Could be weeks, could be months. But they won't stay undercover forever. Eventually, they'll have to surface and start making arrests. And when they do, we better be ready." Their options were limited but clear. They could flee the region immediately, abandoning their property and business interests in favor of starting over in Western territories, where their reputations wouldn't follow them. They could attempt to corrupt or intimidate the detectives, though federal agents were generally more difficult to influence than local officials. Or they could eliminate the immediate threat through direct action, killing the investigators before they could complete their mission and report their findings to superior authorities. Each option carried significant risks and potential consequences. Flight would mean abandoning everything they had built over 8 years of successful partnership, but it would preserve their lives and freedom. Corruption might succeed if the detectives could be convinced that cooperation was more profitable than law enforcement, but failure would confirm their guilt and accelerate prosecution efforts. Murder would solve the immediate problem, but would certainly prompt additional investigations by federal authorities who wouldn't ignore the deaths of their own agents. Andy and Henry spent 3 hours weighing their choices before reaching a decision that reflected both their practical experience and their fundamental character. They would neither flee nor attempt corruption. They would kill the detectives, stage the deaths to look like accidents or random violence, and continue operating their business until the situation stabilized or until additional threats materialized that required similar solutions. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Morrison and Ward would be eliminated during a staged robbery attempt that would appear to be the work of desperate men seeking to steal money and surveying equipment from wealthy outsiders. The bodies would be found in a location that suggested the detectives had been killed while traveling between potential timber properties in isolated mountain terrain. Evidence would be planted to support the robbery theory, and witnesses would be prepared to testify about suspicious strangers who had been seen in the area around the time of the murders. February 14th, 1875, would be the last day that John Morrison and Samuel Ward spent investigating feuding violence in eastern Kentucky. The Cumberland Gap Trail wound through 20 miles of mountain forest between Pikeville and the Virginia border, following ridgelines and creek valleys that had been traveled by hunters and traders since Cherokee times. In winter, the path was treacherous with ice and snow, but it provided the most direct route to timber properties that Morrison and Ward had expressed interest in surveying for potential purchase. The detectives had scheduled their trip for February 14th, planning to spend 3 days examining forest tracks that local brokers claimed contained some of the finest hardwood timber in eastern Kentucky. Andy Boshears and Henry Willis had been watching the trail for 2 days, identifying the perfect location for an ambush that would appear to be a random robbery rather than a planned assassination. The spot they chose was a narrow passage between 2 steep ridges, where the trail curved around a massive boulder that blocked sight lines in both directions. Travelers approaching from either direction would be invisible until they were within 50 yards of the boulder, providing ideal conditions for surprise attack and preventing victims from seeing their killers until it was too late to escape or mount effective resistance. The attack began at 11:30 in the morning, when Morrison and Ward rode around the boulder and found their path blocked by a fallen tree that appeared to have been toppled by recent winter storms. The obstacle forced them to dismount and move the heavy trunk by hand, a process that required both men to set aside their weapons and focus their attention on the physical task of clearing the trail. They were completely vulnerable when Andy opened fire from a concealed position 30 yards uphill from the blocked path. Morrison was struck in the back by the first shot, a large caliber rifle bullet that shattered his spine and dropped him face first onto the frozen ground. Ward reached for his pistol, but was cut down by Henry's shotgun before his weapon cleared its holster, the blast catching him in the chest and throwing him backward against the fallen tree. Both detectives died within seconds of each other, killed so quickly that neither had time to cry out or return fire. The staging that followed, that was as carefully planned as the killing itself. Andy and Henry moved the bodies to positions that suggested a running gunfight between the detectives and multiple attackers. They fired additional shots into trees and rocks to create evidence of a prolonged exchange of gunfire. They scattered the contents of the detectives' saddlebags across a wide area, making it appear that robbers had searched desperately for money and valuables before fleeing into the surrounding forest. Most importantly, they planted evidence that would misdirect any investigation away from their own involvement and toward other suspects who might plausibly have committed the crime. A distinctive knife was left near Morrison's body, a weapon that could be traced to a family of known criminals who lived in Virginia and who frequently crossed into Kentucky to steal livestock and rob travelers. Footprints were created in the muddy ground around the crime scene, prints that matched boots worn by members of the Virginia family, and that would be discovered by investigators seeking to identify the killers. The detectives' horses were driven 15 miles into Virginia territory and released near a settlement, where the animals would be found by residents who might remember seeing them in the possession of suspicious strangers. The surveying equipment was hidden in locations where it could be discovered later by investigators following leads that pointed toward the Virginia criminals. Every detail was designed to create a compelling narrative that would satisfy law enforcement officials seeking to close the case quickly and efficiently. But the most crucial element of the staging was the timeline that Andy and Henry established for their own activities on February 14th. Both men had arranged alibis that would place them far from the murder scene during the relevant time period, with multiple witnesses prepared to testify about their presence at a church social in Pike County, where they had spent the entire day discussing timber investments with local business leaders. The alibis were detailed and mutually supporting, impossible to challenge without proving that dozens of respectable citizens were willing to commit perjury to protect known killers. The bodies were discovered 3 days later by a mail carrier who traveled the Cumberland Gap Trail twice weekly to deliver correspondence between Kentucky and Virginia post offices. Sheriff Hatfield investigated the scene with appropriate diligence, documenting evidence and interviewing potential witnesses who might have information about the crime. His report concluded that Morrison and Ward had been killed by parties unknown who had robbed them during an attempted holdup that escalated into deadly violence when the victims tried to resist. Federal authorities accepted the sheriff's findings without challenge, partly because the evidence supported the robbery theory, and partly because pursuing the case further would require admitting that experienced detectives had been killed while conducting an undercover investigation that had yielded no useful results. The failure reflected poorly on the competence of federal law enforcement and created political embarrassment that superior officers preferred to minimize through quiet acceptance of local conclusions rather than aggressive pursuit of alternative theories. Morrison and Ward were buried in Louisville with full honors, remembered as dedicated public servants who had died in the line of duty while trying to bring law and order to lawless regions of their home state. Their deaths marked the end of the first serious attempt by outside authorities to investigate and prosecute the organized violence that had made eastern Kentucky notorious throughout the region. Andy Boshears and Henry Willis attended the church social in Pike County as planned, expressing appropriate shock and concern when news of the detectives' deaths reached them later that evening. They offered to organize search parties to help local authorities apprehend the criminals responsible for such a heinous crime, and they contributed generously to a reward fund established to encourage information that might lead to the killer's capture. Their performance was flawless, but it would also be their last. The elimination of the federal detectives had solved Andy Boshears and Henry Willis's immediate problem, but it had also set in motion forces that neither man fully understood or could control. The deaths of Morrison and Ward marked them as targets for federal law enforcement agencies that were far more sophisticated and relentless than anything they had faced from local authorities. By the summer of 1875, their names appeared on wanted lists distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the southeastern states, though the evidence supporting federal charges remained insufficient for formal indictments. More dangerous than outside pressure was the internal corruption that success had bred within their own organization. 8 years of profitable partnership had made both men wealthy beyond their original expectations, but wealth had also made them complacent about security measures that had once been observed religiously. They lived in larger houses that were harder to defend. They employed servants who knew details about their business activities. They had accumulated possessions and social obligations that made them reluctant to abandon their established positions for the mobile lifestyle that professional criminals required for long-term survival. The partnership was also showing strain from personality conflicts that had been suppressed during their early years of mutual dependence. Andy had become increasingly autocratic in his decision-making, treating Henry more like an employee than an equal partner, despite their formal agreement to share profits and authority equally. Henry resented this treatment, but felt unable to challenge it directly without risking the dissolution of their arrangement and the loss of income that had supported his family's improved standard of living. Their business model was becoming obsolete as well, undermined by social and economic changes that were transforming the mountain regions where they had built their reputations. Railroad construction was bringing outside investment and legal institutions that reduced the isolation that had enabled feuding violence to flourish without interference. Coal mining was creating wage employment opportunities that offered alternatives to farming and traditional mountain occupations. Younger generations were less committed to feuding traditions and more willing to resolve disputes through legal channels rather than private violence. Most significantly, the culture of impunity that had protected Andy and Henry for 8 years was beginning to erode under pressure from business leaders who needed predictable legal frameworks to attract outside investment and develop industrial enterprises. The random violence that had once been tolerated as an unfortunate but inevitable feature of mountain life was now viewed as an impediment to economic progress that needed to be eliminated through decisive law enforcement action. The beginning of the end came in September of 1875, when a railroad executive named Charles Whitman was killed during what appeared to be a routine contract elimination that Andy and Henry had been hired to perform by a local family seeking to resolve a property dispute. Whitman represented Northern Pacific Railroad interests that were planning to build a spur line through Pike County to transport coal from recently discovered deposits in the Cumberland Mountains. His death triggered investigations by federal agencies that had the resources and authority to pursue cases across state lines and jurisdictional boundaries, unlike the Morrison Ward case, which had been handled discreetly to avoid political embarrassment. The Whitman investigation became a public priority for federal authorities seeking to demonstrate that business investments would be protected by vigorous law enforcement. Treasury agents, federal marshals, and postal inspectors converged on eastern Kentucky with instructions to identify and prosecute everyone responsible for the railroad executive's death, regardless of their local political connections or community standing. The investigation was led by Deputy U.S. Marshal William Tecumseh Davis, a veteran law enforcement officer who had served with distinction during the Civil War and who specialized in cases involving organized criminal enterprises. Davis understood that successful prosecution would require more than solving a single murder. He needed to dismantle the entire network of violence that had made contract killing a profitable business throughout the region. Davis established his headquarters in Lexington and spent 3 months building a comprehensive intelligence picture of feuding activities in eastern Kentucky. He interviewed victims' families, business leaders, political officials, and law enforcement personnel to understand the scope and structure of the criminal networks he was targeting. He identified the key figures responsible for organizing and directing the violence. Most importantly, he developed evidence that would support federal charges under interstate commerce laws and racketeering statutes that carried severe penalties, including death sentences. By December of 1875, Davis had accumulated sufficient evidence to seek federal indictments against Andy Boshears, Henry Willis, and 17 other individuals who had participated in their organization or supported their activities through financial arrangements and political protection. The indictments were sealed until simultaneous arrests could be coordinated across multiple counties, ensuring that none of the targets would have advance warning that might enable them to flee or destroy evidence. The arrests were scheduled for January 15, 1876, but Andy and Henry learned about the planned operation 3 days in advance through political contacts who had been informed by courthouse employees with access to sealed legal documents. They had 72 hours to decide whether to surrender, flee, or fight. Andy Boshears and Henry Willis spent their final 3 days of freedom preparing for a confrontation that both men understood would probably end with their deaths. Flight was no longer a realistic option, since federal authorities had the resources to pursue them anywhere in the United States, and since their wealth was tied to property and businesses that couldn't be liquidated quickly enough to fund an extended period of hiding. Surrender meant certain conviction and probable execution, since the evidence against them was overwhelming, and since federal prosecutors were determined to use their case as an example that would deter similar criminal enterprises. Fighting offered the only possibility of survival, though the odds were heavily stacked against them. Davis had assembled a force of 24 federal agents and U.S. Army soldiers to execute the arrest warrants, with additional reinforcements available if the operation encountered serious resistance. The federal force was well armed, professionally trained, and experienced in conducting military-style operations against organized criminals who were prepared to defend themselves with deadly force. But Andy and Henry had advantages that federal authorities might not have anticipated. They knew the terrain intimately, with detailed knowledge of every trail, creek, and hiding place within 50 miles of their home territory. They had family members and allies who would provide intelligence about federal movements and who might participate in armed resistance if properly motivated. Most importantly, they had nothing left to lose, which made them more dangerous than men who still hoped to preserve their lives and freedom through negotiation or legal maneuvering. The defensive preparations they made during those final 3 days demonstrated the military skills that both men had developed during 8 years of successful partnership in the violence business. They established overlapping fields of fire that would allow them to cover all approaches to their stronghold. They stockpiled ammunition, food, and medical supplies that would enable them to sustain a prolonged siege. They positioned weapons caches and escape routes that would remain viable even if their primary defensive positions were overrun by superior forces. Their stronghold was Andy's cabin on Left Beaver Creek, a 2-story log structure that sat on high ground with clear sight lines in all directions and with access to fresh water from a spring that was protected from outside observation. The building had been modified over the years to serve as both residence and fortress, with rifle ports cut through exterior walls and with interior barriers that would provide cover during room-to-room fighting. The surrounding terrain had been cleared to eliminate concealment for attacking forces, creating a killing field that would exact a heavy price from anyone attempting to assault the position directly. January 15th, 1876, dawned clear and cold, with 6 inches of fresh snow covering the ground and with temperatures well below freezing. Perfect conditions for tracking, but also perfect conditions for defenders who wanted to see their enemies approaching from long distances across open terrain. Andy and Henry were awake before sunrise, checking weapons and equipment one final time before taking their positions for what both men knew would be their last battle. Marshal Davis approached the cabin at 9 o'clock in the morning, leading his force in a tactical formation that reflected both caution and overwhelming superiority. He had positioned sharpshooters on the surrounding ridges to prevent escape and to provide covering fire if the assault became necessary. He had deployed soldiers with military experience in attacking fortified positions. He had even brought a small cannon that could be used to breach the cabin walls if other methods failed to compel surrender. The formal arrest attempt began with Davis riding to within shouting distance of the cabin and calling for Andy and Henry to surrender peacefully. "You're surrounded by federal agents and U.S. Army personnel," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands visible. You have my word that you'll be treated fairly and given proper legal representation." Andy's response came in the form of a rifle shot that passed close enough to Davis's head to part his hair, but that was clearly intended as a warning rather than a killing attempt. "We ain't surrendering to nobody," Andy shouted back. "You want us. You're gonna have to come and take us." The siege that followed lasted 14 hours and became one of the most violent confrontations between federal authorities and organized criminals in Kentucky history. Federal agents and soldiers attacked the cabin 3 times, suffering 11 casualties, including 2 deaths, before finally setting the building on fire with incendiary shells from their small cannon. Even then, Andy and Henry continued fighting from the burning structure until the roof collapsed and ended their resistance permanently. Both men died in the flames, their bodies so badly burned that identification was only possible through dental records and personal jewelry that survived the intense heat. They had killed 2 federal agents and wounded 9 others during the final battle, demonstrating tactical skills and determination that impressed even their enemies. Marshal Davis later wrote that he had never faced more formidable opponents during his long career in law enforcement. The deaths of Andy Boshears and Henry Willis marked the end of the feuding era in eastern Kentucky, though scattered violence continued for several more years before railroad development and coal mining transformed the regional economy sufficiently to eliminate the conditions that had made contract killing profitable. Their partnership had lasted 8 years and had resulted in the deaths of at least 37 people. making them among the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. But their legacy was more complex than simple criminality. They had demonstrated that violence, when properly organized and professionally executed, could become a legitimate business that served genuine market demands within communities where legal institutions were inadequate or untrustworthy. They had shown that traditional feuding could evolve into systematic criminal enterprise that generated substantial profits while maintaining community support and political protection. Most significantly, they had proven that even the most isolated regions could produce criminal organizations sophisticated enough to challenge federal law enforcement and to require military-style operations to eliminate. The ashes of the Boshears cabin were scattered by spring winds across Left Beaver Creek, leaving only a stone foundation and a blackened chimney to mark the place where two of Kentucky's most notorious killers had made their final stand against federal justice. The property was sold at auction to pay court costs and victim compensation, eventually becoming part of a coal mining operation that employed hundreds of workers and contributed millions of dollars to the regional economy. Progress had triumphed over feuding, just as government officials had promised. But the transformation came at a price that was measured in more than dollars and development statistics. Andy Boshears and Henry Willis had been buried in unmarked graves in the Pike County Cemetery. But their reputations lived on in stories told around cabin fires and mining camp gatherings where men spoke admiringly of the partnership that had terrorized eastern Kentucky for 8 years. Children learned their names as examples of mountain courage and independence, while adults invoked their memory when discussing the importance of settling disputes without outside interference. They had become folk heroes whose crimes were remembered as noble resistance to federal tyranny, rather than as murders committed for profit. The families they had served and protected maintained their loyalty even after death, contributing money for legal appeals and memorial services that honored the fallen killers as martyrs who had died defending mountain traditions against outside aggression. Widows of their victims joined the commemorations, understanding that Andy and Henry had been instruments of justice rather than criminals, tools used by the community to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Their deaths were mourned as a loss that left the mountains vulnerable to predators who didn't respect traditional codes of honor and reciprocity. Federal authorities had achieved their primary objective of dismantling the organized violence that threatened business development. But they had also created a mythology that would inspire future generations of mountain criminals who aspired to similar reputations for effectiveness and community support. The example of the Boshears-Willis partnership would be studied and emulated by bootleggers during Prohibition, by organized crime families during the 20th century, and by drug traffickers who understood that successful criminal enterprises required community tolerance and political protection as much as violence and intimidation. The last confirmed sighting of anyone claiming connection to Andy Boshears or Henry Willis occurred in 1937, when an elderly man named Joseph Boshears told a WPA interviewer that his grandfather had been the greatest man who ever lived in Pike County, bar none. Joseph claimed that his grandfather's ghost still walked the ridges above Left Beaver Creek, protecting the mountains from outsiders who threatened traditional ways of life, and ensuring that mountain justice would always triumph over government law when the two came into conflict. The interviewer recorded the story as an example of local folklore, but Joseph spoke with the conviction of someone describing historical fact rather than supernatural legend. Even today, visitors to Pike County occasionally report strange encounters in the hollows and ridges where Andy Boshears and Henry Willis once conducted their deadly business. Though whether these experiences reflect genuine paranormal activity or simply the persistence of cultural memory in places where violence has left permanent impressions remains a matter of interpretation rather than investigation. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.